After Jesus is betrayed, he goes through a court process and then he gets crucified, and we're going to cover all of that in this chapter. And then someone says, he's hanging on the cross and he says these words, my God. And then someone says, let's see if Elijah will come. Isn't that the most random thing ever? You would, what are they thinking? Well, I have a few things to say about that and about wine. And Jesus drinks some wine vinegar on the cross. And we'll talk about all of that soon. But let's read Matthew chapter 15. Immediately in the morning, the chief priests with the elders and scribes and the whole council held a consultation, bound Jesus, carried him away, and delivered him to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "So you say." The chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer? See how many things they testify against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate marvelled. Now, at the feast, he used to release to them one prisoner, whom they asked of him. There was one called Barabbas, bound with his fellow insurgents, men who in the insurrection had committed murder. The multitude, crying aloud, began to ask him to do as he always did for them. Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that for envy the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the multitude, that he should release Barabbas to them instead. Pilate again asked them, "What then should I do to him whom you call the king of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they cried out exceedingly, "Crucify him." Pilate, wishing to please the multitude, released Barabbas to them and handed over Jesus, when he had flogged him, to be crucified. The soldiers led him away within the court, which is the praetorium, and they called together the whole cohort. They clothed him with purple, and weaving a crown of thorns, they put it on him. They began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck his head with a reed and spat on him, and bowing their knees did homage to him. When they had mocked him, they took the purple off him and put his own garments on him. They led him out to crucify him. They compelled one passing by, coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to go with them, that he might bear the cross. They brought him to the place called Golgotha, which is, being interpreted, the place of a skull. They offered him wine mixed with myrrh to drink, but he didn't take it. Crucifying him, they parted his garments among them, casting lots on them what each should take. It was the third hour, and they crucified him. The superscription of his accusation was written over him, "The King of the Jews." With him they crucified two robbers, one on his right hand and one on his left. The scripture was fulfilled which says, "He was counted with transgressors." Those who passed by blasphemed him, wagging their heads and saying, "Ha! You who destroyed the temple and built it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." Likewise, also the chief priests, mocking among themselves with the scribes, said, "He saved others, but he can't save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, now come down from the cross, that we may see and believe him." Those who were crucified with him also insulted him. When the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. At the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which is, being interpreted, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some of those who stood by when they heard it said, "Behold, he is calling Elijah." One ran and, filling a sponge full of vinegar, put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Let him be. Let's see whether Elijah comes to take him down." Jesus cried out with a loud voice and gave up the spirit. The veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. When the centurion who stood by opposite him saw that he cried out like this and breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." There were also women watching from afar, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Less, and of Joseph and Salome, who, when he was in Galilee, followed him and served him, and many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. When evening had now come, because it was the preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent council member who also himself was looking for God's kingdom, came. He boldly went into Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate marveled if he were already dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had been dead long. When he found out from the centurion, he granted the body to Joseph. He brought a linen cloth, and taking him down, wound him in the linen cloth, and laid him in a tomb, which had been cut out of a rock. He rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. All right. Lots of things to say about this chapter. Like all the chapters recently, too much to talk about. In the Beacon Bible Commentary, kind of a slightly older commentary, Elwood Sanner noted that the Sanhedrin broke at least 3 of its own rules in trying Jesus. They met together at night time, which was something one of their personal rules was not to do. They met on a feast day, on the day of Passover, and they didn't individually poll all their members. They broke their own laws. So, according to their own Jewish laws, Jesus is illegally convicted. They accuse Jesus of many things before Pilate. Pilate asks him, "Don't you have an answer?" He says nothing. That's a fulfillment of Isaiah 53, where it says, "As a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he does not open his mouth." And then, after Pilate can't, make progress there, he decides to try tact number 2, or tack number 2, and he suggests that they, every Passover we release someone, and how about we release this Jesus? And they all demand Barabbas to be released. Barabbas, it says here, was guilty of insurrection, having committed murder. Insurrection is where you try to overthrow the regime. So Barabbas and others, not just him on his own, have tried to overthrow the regime. And they are scheduled for execution. In fact, they're scheduled for execution this very day. Have you ever wondered why Jesus died with 2 others on the cross? Because those 2 others were already scheduled for execution. And guess who the third person is that was going to be executed the same day? Barabbas and these other 2, the 3 of them were scheduled for execution, but Jesus comes along. They don't know about him. The Jews bring him along unexpectedly. Pilate says, "Who shall I release?" Barabbas gets off, and Jesus is executed instead of Barabbas. Jesus is treated like an insurrectionist, but he never did anything insurrectionist at all. Jesus always had utmost respect for Roman government. But Barabbas, who actually didn't have respect for government, he gets off scot-free. Sounds a lot like you and me. We don't have respect for God's laws and God's mind. We can grow and come to that place of having respect. But that's not where we start off. We start off as insurrectionists. But Jesus dies in our place. And so they say about Jesus, crucify him. And about Barabbas, release him. So Jesus goes off to the cross. He's crucified in between 2 thieves. On the way, they ask Simon of Cyrene to help him carry the cross. And it says in here, verse 21, it says, "They compelled one passing by, coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to go with them, that he might bear his cross." That's interesting. He's the father of Alexander and Rufus. So it's just like a strange, random thing to include. They compelled this guy who's coming from the country, and oh, by the way, he's Alexander and Rufus's dad. You might know them. We don't. But Alexander and Rufus actually later on in Paul's letter to the book of Rome, to the Romans, letter to Rome, I'm pretty sure it's Rufus that he says, "Greet Rufus." It's the same guy. The thought is that after this, Simon of Cyrene becomes a believer, becomes a Christian. Like his encounter with Jesus causes him to become a believer. His whole family gets saved. They end up moving to Rome. Something happens to Simon, but Rufus ends up living in Rome and he gets a mention in Paul's letter. Super cool. And Mark mentions it here because he's writing this gospel to Christians in Rome, and guess what? They knew Alexander and Rufus. So he's like writing to the people in Rome and saying, Simon carried the cross. P.S. Alexander and Rufus's dad. Super cool. So Simon helps Jesus carry the cross. They get it to the place of execution. They offer Jesus wine with myrrh. He doesn't want it. There's a reason why he doesn't want it. But he has the next offer of drink, which is the wine vinegar. When Jesus was in the Passover, and I was meant to mention this yesterday's video, but too many things to think of. Jesus was having his own Passover meal. The Jewish Passover meal has a series of times when you drink wine. When Jesus had the Last Supper with his disciples, he doesn't drink wine the last time. The Passover normally has a certain way of finishing. They often have a seat at the table that's left empty. That seat is left for Elijah, the prophet. They set up a place for him. Elijah, in theory, could join Jewish people for the Passover meal. Jewish people always believed that Elijah would come just before the Messiah. So when they have their Passover, they leave a spot for Elijah. And often they will say something like, they'd finish off their Passover with like this final cup of wine and this kind of like comment on, hopefully Elijah will come and we'll have Passover next year in Jerusalem, something like that. And if you're listening and you're Jewish, you might comment precisely how that happens. I read some different things, and sometimes people don't quite say the exact same thing as each other. But the idea is that there's this idea that Elijah is going to come, and there's always this looking forward to the Messiah and having Passover in Jerusalem. So Jesus, when he has his Passover meal, he finishes it a drink too soon. There's one kind of like drink missing, the last drink of wine. But Jesus gets to the cross, and before he dies, they offer him a drink of wine, and he says no. But when he's on the cross, they offer him a drink of wine vinegar, and they lift up hyssop. Hyssop itself is also a Passover symbol. Lift it up to his lips. It's like a spongy thing. He sucks the wine in and has his fourth drink. He finishes the Passover off on the cross. He himself is the Passover lamb. He dies on the cross at the exact moment that the Passover lamb dies, and then someone there says perhaps he's calling Elijah. Now, isn't that what they do in their Passover celebrations? Let's see if Elijah will come. Now, they don't realize that Elijah actually already came. Elijah was John the Baptist. But the tradition of what happens at Passover happens right here on the cross. Jesus saves up his last drink of wine, and then the Passover meal, you could say, that was started the night before finishes with Jesus on the cross. In other words, he is the complete fulfillment of Passover. Then he gives up his spirit. The veil of the temple is torn in two. You could see right into the Holy of Holies. You see that it's completely empty. The presence of God is not there anymore. Jesus has done away with the old temple. He himself is the new temple. He himself has now established the kingdom. He is our Passover lamb. There's now no more need for the other Passover lamb. We're now in the days of the Messiah. Super cool. Or maybe it's technically from the resurrection, but you can see the wonderful symbolism in all of this. And there were Jewish people who saw it all. People like Paul, he didn't see it straight away, but he saw it all. It all became so alive and so real. And, mere mortals like us Jewish people, we have to learn all this stuff. And but Jesus is now our temple. Jesus is now our high priest. Jesus is the holy place, and we want to enter into him. Jesus is our sacrifice. Jesus is our atonement. Jesus is everything to us. And so he is the one we seek and the one we follow. Lord, thank you for what you've done for us, your sacrifice. Thank you for taking our place on the cross. Lord, thank you that like Barabbas, we go free. Lord, guilty of insurrection and lawlessness against you, you instead have given us a heart of love, that we long to follow you and long to follow your law and walk in your ways. Help us, I pray. Amen.